Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Ruben Lamdany about the IMF and the global financial crisis. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international affairs, or some other aspect of international public policy here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Ruben Lamdany. He is the Deputy Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the International Monetary Fund. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if we could start, but just ask you, what is the Independent Evaluation Office? When was it established? What's its mandate?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. The Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, the IEO, was created in 2001 following the East Asian crisis. The international community had the feeling that the fund had not done as good a job as it could have done in responding to the East Asian crisis, and that some independent analysis was needed. So this is a very small office. It's independent from management. The head of the office is selected through a political process like the managing director of the IMF. And we are 10 people. We issue about 2 evaluations a year. We are completely independent in the choice of topics, and we have the right to see all the internal documentation of the IMF. We have produced so far 23 reports dealing on all aspects, from technical assistance, lending, surveillance, even the governance of the IMF. And on a Canadian note, the second director of the IEO, right, and one of the creators of the IEO before that as an executive director of Canada was Tom Burns, right, who was also a director of CIGI.
That's right. Now, your office has recently come out with a report on the International Monetary Fund and the financial and economic crisis of 2008. What prompted the report?
Well, this is the issue of our time, and therefore we look at the most relevant issues. In fact, it is a natural continuation of a report that we produced 3 years ago and that I presented here at CIGI as well, on the run-up to the crisis, right, on which I believe I have a podcast here too. And there was some give and take in the timing of this evaluation, but there was no doubt that we needed to do it, so that we made sure not to interfere with activities of the fund. That's our only constraint. Right. And because of that, we carved out the Eurozone programs, which we are only now beginning to evaluate as the 3 original programs for Greece, Portugal, and Ireland have been completed. So we've completed this evaluation last summer. It was discussed at the board of the IMF in October. Right. And we believe that now some of our recommendations are being implemented.
Great. Well, I would like to come back to the recommendations later on. But one of the things I found fascinating about the report was that you reflected on where the IMF was as an institution in 2008. And it was at a really critical point in its history as an institution. Could you remind our audience a bit about what the IMF was like in 2008?
Well, the IMF was in a very weak position in 2008 and also 2007. In 2008, the world was not in a good position, but in 2006, 2007, the world, many people thought that the IMF was not needed, right, anymore because of the prosperity that had been the determinant of the world for a few years. In any case, we're all for a big surprise. But the fund was in a very weak position. It had a legitimacy problem because of perceptions on how it had done in dealing with previous crises, right, and because emerging markets and low-income countries felt that they were not adequately represented in the governance of the fund. Right. It also, and perhaps because of that, had not received any increase in its quotas, in the capital that the fund has, that belongs to the member countries, and the quotas were at the lowest level as a share of GDP or as a share of a potential need ever, except that there was not a lot of lending. There was, in fact, no lending, so people felt, well, maybe we don't need a firefighter anymore, since there will be never more fires. And the final thing is that because of all these things, it had undertaken a downsizing. So going into the crisis, the fund got rid of about 1/5 of its senior staff, what put it in a very difficult position to respond. Still, as the report documents, it was very quick at turning around, responding, and it was able to find the people and the resources to respond to the crisis.
Well, and perhaps just picking up on that point, your report suggests that overall the performance or the reaction of the IMF was generally quite good, but there were some shortcomings. Could you say a little bit about the types of things that the IMF did after the crisis in order to try and mitigate the fallout?
Well, first of all, very quickly began working with others. It worked very closely with the G20 and with other groupings of countries and organizations. And authorities all over the world and in these institutions report that the fund was more cooperative and more of a team player than it had been in the past. That's good. It also embarked in a very quick process of raising resources that enabled it to raise to triple the amount of resources it had to lend to about $1 trillion. Right. And that enabled it to increase its non-concessional lending from close to zero to about $300 billion in a few years. Right. At the same time, and these programs were designed in a way that reflect the lessons from previous crises. Right. So they were negotiated quickly, they were rich, they were large. Only 60% of the resources were dispersed because they were sufficiently large to give confidence to the markets, and countries were able to go back to the markets. Conditionality was not too burdensome. There was no attempt to have everybody contract at the same time. In a global crisis, that's not a very constructive thing.
Of course.
But it had happened in the past, but this time that lesson was learned. And member countries report that there was a better relationship. At the same time, in surveillance, in its diagnosis and advice to the overall international community and to individual countries, it had a very timely and influential advice in 2008 and 2009. It was one of the first to call, or probably the first to call, for a global coordinated fiscal expansion of 2% of GDP. And that influenced the decisions of the G20 and brought about a relatively quick coming out of what looked could become a new big depression. It also supported the rapid monetary expansion that occurred at that time, and a turnaround from its very laissez-faire attitude towards financial markets to a more prudent view of the need to have sufficient capital and to contain the risk of contagion across borders. Overall, a turnaround from what used to be before the typical interventions. And the report is congratulatory about that.
Absolutely. It does also, though, highlight some of the missteps along the way or some of the shortcomings within the fund itself. Could you say a little bit about those?
Well, one can divide this into, actually, there are three legs. There is coordinating with others, there is surveillance, and there is lending. So on coordinating with others, everybody was a little concerned that in working together with the G20, with the Troika, perhaps the independence of the fund may have gotten diluted.
Right.
So there is a call within the membership to specify more clearly the responsibilities and accountabilities of the fund, who the fund staff reports to and is accountable to. With respect to the resources available for the future, right now, 70% of the resources of the fund are borrowed from the members, as opposed to being quotas of. And that is a worrisome, or could become a problem,
right,
because those resources may disappear when they are most needed. That's a risk, as opposed to quotas that are there.
right.
And two, the reform, the increase in the quotas, would have allowed for an increase in the share of emerging markets and low-income countries, and therefore of their role in the governance of the institution, and that has not taken place.
Right.
So the resources are not there, and the quota reform in the governance has not taken place. Finally, on the lending, on the surveillance side, we found that there was a premature shift from fiscal expansion to consolidation.
Right.
In 2010, partly because the projections of the fund said that there was already a recovery, a sustained recovery in place, but also for other reasons that are more difficult to discern, the fund began calling for a fiscal consolidation, and that turned out to be premature. The policy mix between fiscal and monetary became too heavily reliant on monetary policy, which has some negative impact, had some negative impact on emerging markets and low-income countries because of the tendency to bring a real appreciation, to bring perhaps bubbles there, but also because it's not as effective. And this is something that has been documented many times. To the fund merit, one should say that by 2013, fund staff recognized this and began calling for a more moderate pace of consolidation.
Right.
And it is probably, it will take a long time to know exactly what it should have been done, but I think it is now widely accepted that that was a mistake. Another reason for this mistake is that the fund staff found itself in the awkward position of having to tell the largest members that they perhaps were pursuing the wrong policies, because many of them were calling already for consolidation. So it's a complex diagnosis for a complex advice.
Absolutely. Now, your report does make a series of recommendations that do cover a wide range of areas. Could you say a little bit about what your office is proposing in terms of going forward?
Well, the report asks at the end the following two questions. Is the fund now, or what it would take for the fund to be better equipped to be able to anticipate future crises and warn the members about that? And two, if those crises occur, would the fund be better equipped to respond to them?
Right.
With respect to anticipating, the fund has done a lot of work on strengthening its framework for early warning.
Right.
But we found that now there are too many exercises, too many reports. There is so much material there that the members have great difficulty, the countries have great difficulty to discerning what is that the fund message is.
Right.
And in fact, even within the fund, cooperation, which has improved, has not led to full coherence of this. So for example, in 2013, in the spring, different parts of the fund were having a complete different message about the main issue of that day, which was what would happen when tapering of monetary policy of the quantitative easing will begin to occur. Some parts of the fund were saying no big deal, others were saying it could bring a major crisis. So we think that there is still a need for greater cooperation within the fund and for more consolidation. So it's prioritization and consolidation would help in that. We also believe that the fund has made great efforts in becoming an open platform for, bringing the main issues of the day into debate. And we hope that it can continue fostering that. It's easier to be very open and allow for a lot of discussions in times of crisis and when you are caught as, well, I didn't see it. So now, when the situation is more stable, there may be a tendency for groupthink and insularity to reappear. Okay. So we hope it doesn't. With respect to the resources, well, actually, on the issue of consolidation and prioritization, we think that the fund needs to have its financial sector surveillance, over which I haven't said much, focus more on the countries that are a systemic risk. Right now, the fund has a program of doing financial surveillance, which doesn't give more weight to the truly systemic countries. It focuses on everybody, but in particular on the 29 main financial centers. We think it should be looking at 3, 4, 5, maybe 7. But on the resources, we think that right now the fund seems to have the resources it needs to do the work, but they are borrowed. So we think that these resources need to be in the form of quota. As you may know, in 2010, there was a decision on a quota reform that has not yet been ratified. So the ratification of that reform would go a long way towards getting the ratio between borrowed and owned resources in the right place. And finally, the fund needs to have a protocol on how it works with other organizations and with country groupings, so that there will be a greater sense among the whole membership that there is equal treatment and that the fund staff remains independent of any pressures.
Right. And are you optimistic that the recommendations in your report will be adopted?
Well, during the board discussion, or towards the board discussion, management of the fund has to explain how they see it. And they agreed with all but one of the recommendations, which was on this issue of greater focus on the financial surveillance. But in fact, they propose an alternative way of perhaps achieving the same results. We think our suggestions may have been a little better, but theirs aim at the same direction. So management is committed to this type of reforms. Whether the membership, whether the largest countries are willing to increase the capital of the fund,
Right.
to change the governance structure. That is something on which I cannot really pass any judgment.
Right. So perhaps just to wrap up, if we could come back to your question, in your view, is the IMF today equipped to A, first predict the next financial crisis, and then B, to mitigate it?
Well, I think the fund is better equipped to predict the previous crisis.
Okay.
And it's difficult to know what, how the next crisis will look like.
Right.
As I mentioned before, it needs to consolidate and sharpen some of its exercises on the surveillance part. And it needs to specify rules of the game so that the staff feels comfortable being able to raise difficult questions to the member countries. So this is a situation in which it is not only up to the staff of the fund and its management, but also up to the largest member countries, right, to encourage this type of controversial discussions so that the fund does not fall back into groupthink and intellectual capture, which is what led to the problems in 2007 and 8.
Great. Ruben, this has been wonderful. It's been great having you back on the program, and best of luck with this report and the ones that follow up.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Today my guest is Ruben Lamdany. He is the Deputy Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the International Monetary Fund. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if we could start, but just ask you, what is the Independent Evaluation Office? When was it established? What's its mandate?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. The Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, the IEO,
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Ruben Lamdany about the IMF.
It was created in 2001 following the East Asian crisis. The international community had the feeling that the fund had not done as good a job as it could have done in responding to the East Asian crisis, and that some independent analysis was needed. So this is a very small office.
In the global financial crisis. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international affairs, or some other aspect of international public policy here to the studio in Waterloo.
It's independent from management. The head of the office is selected through a political process like the managing director of the IMF. And we are 10 people. We issue about 2 evaluations a year. We are completely independent in the choice of topics. And we have the right to see all the internal documentation of the IMF. We have produced